It's time to venture back into the world of Windows handhelds, but this time something's a bit different. Enter Xbox, who promises to be a new ally for ASUS and their PC-focused handhelds. ASUS returns with a pair of new handhelds, the ROG Xbox Ally X, which is the cutting-edge, high-end variant, and this model, the ROG Xbox Ally, which is the entry-level version designed to bring handheld freedom for everyone. The Xbox Ally is powered by AMD's Z2A processor, which claims to bring performance increases over the older base Ally Z1, as well as refinements to the ergonomics and, most importantly, the user experience, with the all-new Xbox full-screen experience. So, please join me, Rob the Retro Tech Dad, as we reunite with ASUS and the ROG Ally and find out if the power of Xbox is enough to make this one ally you want by your side. As we always do, let's talk specs, pricing, do a little quick unboxing, and tour around the ROG Xbox Ally, which ships with this substantial box that is in white to differentiate between the two models shipping, and the differences between the Xbox Ally and the Xbox Ally X go beyond just the box. And it really starts with what's under the hood, since this Ally ships with AMD's Z2A chipset, which is a Zen 2 based 4-core 8-thread processor that features frequencies up to 3.8 GHz and AMD RDNA 2 graphics with a default TDP of 15 watts that is adjustable from 6 to 20 watts. Now we're going to talk more about this chipset because the Z2A is actually a familiar friend with a new skin, and it's not the only familiar feature here, since the Xbox Ally sees the return of its excellent 7-inch IPS display with a resolution of 1920 by 1080, which supports 120Hz VRR that tops out at a max 500 nits of brightness. The panel is excellent, and much like we saw with the original Allies and the Ally X, it's definitely one of the better IPS displays with solid colors, viewing angles, and contrast. My unit doesn't seem to have any issues with backlight bleeding, and while it would have been nice to see an OLED panel be used here, I can understand that the entry-level model not featuring it. As I mentioned earlier, ASUS does have two new models of the Xbox Ally. But specifically for this model, ASUS is offering one configuration as of now, which ships with 16GB of LPDDR5, 6400 MHz RAM, and 512GB of internal PCI Express 4.0 storage, which can be upgraded using the M.2 2280 slot, as well as storage expansion with the microSD slot, and we will take a look at the upgrade process for the storage during the mini teardown segment. The Xbox Ally features two USB 3.2 Gen 2 Type-C ports with support for DisplayPort 1.4 and Power Delivery 3.0, as well as Wi-Fi 6E, Bluetooth 5.4, and a 3.5mm headset port. It's powered by a 60 Wh battery, and inside the box ASUS has included a USB-C 65W power adapter, as well as an insert kindly reminding you to plug in before powering on, and some other booklets and warranty information, nothing too fancy here. Now, the ROG Xbox Ally should be available for purchase by the time this video publishes direct from Microsoft and ASUS's website, as well as online at places like Amazon.com for $599 for the model that I have in hand. I'd like to thank ASUS for providing this unit in advance of the release so that I can spend quality time with it and put together this in-depth video of the device. As I always require, this video was not reviewed prior to publishing. So let's go around and take a tour of the Xbox Ally, which, coming from the prior generations, sees its biggest cosmetic change. And it all starts at the top with the larger shoulder buttons and triggers, which managed to come in larger than the Ally X, and it's almost comical how much larger the new Xbox Ally triggers are in comparison to the original Ally model. The larger shoulder buttons and triggers are very much welcome here, as this does play into its improved ergonomics, and really makes them a delight to use. The shoulder buttons feel and sound almost identical to the Ally X, and they have a very subtle clickiness to them that is quite quiet. Now, I am happy that ASUS went back and refined the shoulder triggers, as these do feel much better than the prior generations. To me, it's amazing just how quiet and smooth the movement is on the triggers, and the amount of resistance here is just right, and much better than what we got with the older models. It's very obvious that ASUS studied aspects of the Xbox Series controller. Now going across the top, we have a bunch of inputs here to talk about, starting from the right with the power button that has an integrated fingerprint sensor, and then going across we have the 3.5mm headset port, the micro SD slot, an exhaust vent, the volume up and down buttons, indicator lights, and finally 2 USB-C 3.2 ports, which again does have support for DisplayPort 1.4 and Power Delivery 3.0, but unlike its more expensive counterpart, it does not feature USB 4 with support for Thunderbolt 4. And then below this row we have 2 additional exhaust vents, and it's very obvious that ASUS is wanting to keep the Ally as cool as possible. Now coming down the left and right sides, we have the most obvious cosmetic change here, which are the addition of these very pronounced grips that, at least as ASUS and Xbox have demonstrated to us, were inspired by the Xbox Series controller. And they even had an example of essentially an Xbox controller that was cut in half with the screen placed in the middle. Now I'm very much in the camp of just going all out with ergonomics at this size, since realistically you're not going to be pocketing any of these handheld, and so I do believe comfort should be a priority, and it's a massive improvement in that department. The Xbox Ally in particular feels lighter than it should given the 60 watt-hour battery, and it is very nicely balanced in the hands. This is easily one I can game on for an extended amount of time, and I actually did do that on my flight home from New York to Phoenix last week. Now it may not lend itself in the way of beauty here, but I'll take this over the prior Ally X, and especially the original Ally, which was a bit angular in the hands. Now one thing in particular that stood out to me was the thickness of the Xbox Ally, which does look a bit chunky visually. And I can confirm that it is in fact a thicker body than even the Ally X with its larger battery at about 2.5mm more than the Ally X. So looking at the back, and again we can see those very obvious grips with a nice and subtle texture, very similar to an Xbox Series controller that does add to the overall grip of the handheld. The center does remain quite familiar and similar to the Ally X and original Ally. Now I do wish the rear programmable buttons were a bit bigger like the original Ally, since they are a bit awkward to press down on, and it would have just been nice to have that larger surface area to press down on. So let's now come front side, and on the left we've got our full size analog stick with RGB and the D-pad, which is very similar to the one found on the Ally X, and it's a very subtle difference, and it could just very well be that this is new and not worn in, but I do feel that there is a more pronounced pivot and movement on the Xbox Ally's D-pad. Now it's not my favorite design by any means, and at least coming from the first gen, it's definitely an improvement. Now what's funny is that the D-pad is really nothing like we've seen on current Xbox controllers, which I find interesting considering the partnership here between the brands. The D-pad does work well enough in fighting games, but again this isn't anything revolutionary, and it's what I would say is serviceable. Now above the D-pad we do have a cluster of buttons, and for the first time ever, we have a dedicated Xbox button here on the Ally handheld, which in combination with the Xbox full screen experience is utilized to help you navigate within this new interface. And it becomes a very seamless and important part of this handheld. Now another thing that is interesting here is that they now opted to swap the select and quick access for Armory Crate, which was driving me a little crazy going back and forth between the devices. But yes, we do have the return of that quick access button, and these all have very subtle presses and are very quiet. Now on the other side, we have the start button and the dedicated button to bring up the Armory Crate software. Again, these have been swapped from prior generations. Now next to these, we have the face buttons in the Xbox ABXY configuration, and I do really like that we are getting those Xbox colors here for the ABXY. These buttons seem like they have a subtle difference, but again, it could just be that this is a newer unit, but I do find that it's just slightly less stiff to press down on, which is a good thing. And they are quiet as well, and less noisy than when compared to even an Xbox controller. Now below the face buttons, we do have that other full-size analog stick, and then finally of course we have the front firing stereo speakers, and these are in a great position that remain unobstructed when in your hands, and most importantly the sound is firing straight at you, which is exactly what you want. These are pretty solid speakers that can get quite loud on the highest end, and definitely will suit you well in most situations. And overall, the build quality is solid. I think the refinements here are welcome, and the handheld just feels good in your hands as it should, and the little details throughout really add a level of polish and finish here. Now speaking of polish and finish, this seems like the perfect segue into the software side, and it's now time to explore briefly, as I like to call it, the not quite Xbox experience. Let's just get this out of the way right now, and no, this is not an Xbox in the sense that you're getting your Xbox Series S or X in a handheld. Now, I'm pretty sure my unit is close to retail representation, and the first real reminder that you're still on Windows 11 is the full-blown initial setup that you usually see when powering on a computer with Windows 11 for the first time. And I'm actually using the Xbox Ally X here to demonstrate it, since I first set up the Xbox Ally in a hotel room where I was greeted with a good 2 to 3 hours worth of updates between Windows, the Xbox app, Armory Crate, and my ASUS, and I do hope that units that ship in the future will have undergone most of these steps to get to the final goal here, which is the Xbox full screen experience. At first glance, this does look very familiar, and if you've used the Xbox app before, then this is essentially what you're looking at. And that's all you will be looking at, because gone is the Windows desktop, and holding down the dedicated Xbox button reveals a very slick interface that allows you to switch to apps on the fly or boot back into the Windows desktop, which loads in almost an instant. Now, if you wanted to go back to the Xbox full screen experience, you would select the option from the Xbox app, and then you are presented with either the choice to just hop right back in, but this means that all of the additional backend Windows components will still be loaded in, and so there is the option to restart back into Xbox full screen experience for the best optimization. This is an important first step for Microsoft that I hope they will continue to build on for the handheld experience, since this is the most serious attempt by Microsoft to address the biggest issue that most of these Windows-based handhelds have faced, which is Windows. Now, the reason why I say that this is an important first step is because this is still Windows, and believe me, you will be reminded of that fact as you use the Xbox full screen experience, with things like security prompts, notifications that you'd find in Windows that pop up here, and even the small little things like standby occasionally being broken and your handheld decides to turn itself back on to the Windows sign-on screen. In fact, just going through my own usual testing and adding things like emulators, which I downloaded from the Edge browser as it was an available app in the Xbox full screen experience, meant that I had to go into desktop since there were very specific security prompts that I did not get while in Xbox full screen experience, and so there is this feeling of it being a little bit disjointed, for better or worse, since while I might be very comfortable with Windows personally, this could lead to some frustrations for someone that simply is expecting something more like a SteamOS or even an Xbox console experience. Again, this is still very much Windows, and hopefully Microsoft will continue to push with what they're cooking up with the Xbox full screen experience. In terms of the ROG Ally specifically, I still think Armory Crate is among the best in terms of software integration by an OEM, and it's very apparent in the quick access panel just how refined it is today compared to the very first day back with the original Ally in 2023. In fact, I have found myself making use of Armory Crate because of its seamless integration here with Xbox full screen experience and beyond the services that the Xbox app itself supports, which includes Steam, Epic, Battle.net, GOG Galaxy, and Ubisoft Connect. I will use Armory Crate as a way to add my own things that I'd want to have access to while in Xbox full screen experience, like RPCS3 and Xena Canary, which I can launch right from Armory Crate, at least after it's been set up first in Windows Desktop and then added here. So going back to the Xbox app, this is the hub to be able to access other Xbox branded services like Xbox Game Pass and cloud gaming, as well as any titles that are Xbox Play Anywhere compatible, which right now has over 1,000 games, and I will link you to that list if you're curious about whether some of the games you're interested in supports this, because as I mentioned earlier, this is not an Xbox, at least not in the traditional sense, and so if you bought a game on your Xbox console, it will need to be a Play Anywhere title in order for it to work here. And how it works here could either be natively as a PC download or through the cloud with streaming, which has its own hurdles. I do want to reiterate that I really like what's happening here with Xbox full screen experience, and I find myself wanting to spend as much time as possible here when I'm using a handheld, since at the end of the day, I want to stay focused on gaming, and I think with time, a handheld user might be able to fully stay in this experience. And so let's now take a peek under the hood of the Xbox Ally and do a little bit of a mini teardown. And I say mini teardown because the goal of this is to see how easy it is to gain access to the internal drive for upgrading, as well as that 60 watt-hour battery for servicing and maybe some additional components. So I've got my iFixit kit ready to go, and it looks like on the back we've got a few screws that are visible. There are 5 screws on the back and then an additional 3 at the bottom of the unit. I'll go ahead and use a Phillips head size 0-bit for this, and let's quickly get these 8 total screws removed from the shell. Now make sure to keep your screws in order, as the ones on the bottom are actually shorter than the 5 that are on the back of the Ally. The back cover actually comes off pretty easily with a pick, and just start at the top and then gently go around the unit with the pick, but it should start separate without much issue, and then once you've got enough separation, just go ahead and do the rest by hand. Now don't go prying off the back cover too aggressively, as there is a cable that is connected to the back cover and the main board, which is for the programmable buttons on the back. So let's gently lift the protective tape and then disconnect the cable from the board by flipping up the connection and removing it from here. This allows us to take a better look at the back cover now with it fully removed from the handheld, and this is definitely not the most rigid piece of plastic, and it is quite flexible. Now on the inside of this back cover, you can see that we do have a filter to prevent dust from getting inside the Ally, and then of course the programmable buttons that are attached to this piece as well. So let's put this aside and now dive into the handheld itself. With the back cover removed, we can see quite a bit that's visible just from simply removing this back cover, including the dual fans, the 60 watt-hour battery, the boards for the analog sticks, and even the M.2 2280 internal storage. And right off the bat, this looks very good in terms of servicing, as the most critical components are easily accessible for servicing or even replacing. Let's go ahead and take a look at one of the analog sticks here, and you'll notice that both analog sticks are readily accessible by just simply removing the 3 screws that hold them into place. I'll continue to use the same Phillips head 0-bit since it does seem to do the trick here. Now before we start removing the screws, make sure to disconnect the cable by gently lifting up the flap and then removing it. Once the 3 screws have been removed, the analog stick will come right out, and this is quite simple to get to. So I think the next order of business here is to gain access to the 2280 drive, since this model of the Ally comes with a 512GB drive, and maybe in the future you want to upgrade to a 1TB drive or perhaps something larger. The nice thing is that this is also immediately accessible, and the only thing I'd recommend doing is just disconnecting the battery connection so that it's not in the way. The battery connection on the main board is held in with a tab that you pull down, as you can see in the footage, which unlocks the cable, and then you just simply lift it out of the connection to disconnect it. With that cable out of the way, let's look at the SSD, and this does have a protective sleeve on it, which is just something to be mindful of. Let's remove the 1 screw holding the drive into place, and don't be afraid to lift it out, as there is some tape holding the drive down on the bottom, which isn't immediately obvious or visible at first. You can see that I had to separate the tape, which is still on the main board, and this is just a plastic protective sleeve that I can actually slide the drive out of, and so I'd recommend trying to handle the sleeve with some care if you want to reuse it. But yeah, this is very simple to get to, and it's nice to see that it isn't buried under anything else, and of course the best part is that this is using a 2280 drive, so it's easy to find a cost-effective replacement. Finally, let's take a look at the battery, which obviously is immediately accessible as well, and since we've already disconnected the battery, let's just go ahead and remove the 5 screws that are holding its cage in place. Again, be mindful of the screw sizes, as they are different, with the ones on the bottom being shorter than the ones at the top. Bada bing bada boom, screws removed, and the battery and its cage lift right out, and again, this is a 60 watt-hour battery, which sees an increase in capacity coming from that Z1 Ally, as well as a larger battery than what we get with both versions of the Steam Deck. Thanks to the removal of the battery, you also get to peek at the speakers that power the Ally, which were underneath it. Now, since I went through this process already, my advice to someone that maybe wants to upgrade the SSD is to actually remove the battery first, which does make it a little bit easier to get to the drive, especially if you're wanting to reuse that sleeve. Okay, so with all of that, I've satisfied what I wanted to take a look at during this mini teardown, and now we are ready to crunch some numbers and learn more about AMD's Z2A processor, which is one of 5 different Z2 chipsets that AMD is offering up. And if you weren't already confused by all of these names and variants, it gets even more confusing once you start to examine the lineup in its entirety, which features AMD technology across various generations, going back to the Zen 2 and RDNA 2, all the way up to the current tech with Zen 5 and RDNA 3.5. And if you explore the makeup of some of these chips, it's apparent that some are just rebranded with minor tweaks, or even some being potentially bin chips that reappear here in this lineup. Now, of course, the focus for this video is on the AMD Z2A, and so let's explore this chip a bit further. And when looking at the specs for the Z2A, which is based on AMD's Van Gogh and consists of 4 cores and 8 threads using Zen 2, as well as 8 RDNA 2 CUs, and that memory support for LPDDR5 up to 6400 MHz with a configurable TDP of 6 watts to 20 watts, this specific makeup starts to resemble a very familiar chip on the market, and one that has been seen before in the Steam Deck. especially since its APU is also based on AMD's Van Gogh. Now, at first glance, it might not be as apparent, since the Steam Deck APU in the OLED model comes with a configurable TDP of 4 to 15 watts, but features a similar makeup of 4 cores and 8 threads with Zen 2, and features clock speeds up to 3.5 GHz with 8 RDNA 2 CUs up to 1.6 GHz, which is the same design as the Z2A, except that the Z2A allows us to go up to 20 watts and features slightly higher clock speeds with the CPU going up to 3.8 GHz and the GPU going up to 1.8 GHz. And so in many ways, this Xbox Ally with the Z2A is positioned against the Steam Deck OLED, and since both share fairly similar price points, with the Steam Deck OLED coming in at $549 US and this Xbox Ally at $599 US, we will definitely be looking at how these two compare and just how similar performance is between the two, as well as bring in the original 2023 Ally with the Z1, which, like the Xbox Ally, released for $599 US, and finally the Ally X with the Z1 Extreme, since we do have a few handhelds with that chipset, and so it becomes an option worth considering when looking at sales and perhaps the second-hand market as an alternative place to put your $599. So all the game benchmarks were conducted at the 15-watt TDP and at a resolution of 1280 by 720 to keep all devices in line, and since the Z2A is a handheld specifically targeting 720p gaming. Now, I will have a chart in a moment that outlines the small advantage for the Z2A that can go to 20 watts compared to the Steam Deck OLED at 15 watts in just a little bit. But let's start out with the tried and true and one of the older benchmarks, with Shadow of the Tomb Raider, and the Z2A comes in with an average of 54 frames per second. And let's bring in that Z1 Ally, which, as I mentioned, the Xbox Ally with the Z2A essentially replaces that model in the lineup, and the Z1 does fall behind with an average of 45 frames per second. Then we've got the Ally X with the Z1E, and even at 15 watts, it outperforms both the Z2A and Z1 with an average of 65 frames per second, and as I mentioned, handhelds with the Z1E are still very much worth considering. Finally, the Steam Deck OLED, which came in with a very strong average of 61 frames per second, and I do believe that SteamOS is helping a bit here with the performance. Okay, so let's move on to the Forza Horizon 5 benchmark, and here things are a little bit interesting, with the Z2A coming in with a 69.6 average frames per second, and then the Z1 with an average of 64.5, and the Z1 has always been a strong performer with this game. And then the Z1 Extreme, which just dominates with its 103.2 average frames per second. Finally, the Steam Deck OLED came in with an average of 70.8, which really puts it at almost an identical average as the Z2A. And of course, we've got to cover some Cyberpunk numbers, and for this we are going to be using this Steam Deck preset, and at that 15-watt TDP, we're looking at an average of 40.85 frames per second, and with the original Ally and its Z1 coming in at an average of 38.17. And then the more powerful Ally X with the Z1 Extreme, unsurprisingly coming in at a higher average with 47.19. And finally the Steam Deck, which came in with an average of 44.92, and a very interesting high max FPS, which I did run a few times and it just seems to be a consistent number. Regardless, looking at the averages here, and that Z2A is pretty close to the Steam Deck's APU, and it will be interesting to see if the 20-watt preset can help close the gap. Black Myth Wukong is another in-game benchmark that is a solid way to really push these handhelds, as it is very demanding, and the Z2A came in with just an average of 29 frames per second, with the Z1 really struggling here with just an average of 23 frames per second, and even the Z1 Extreme at 15 watts is struggling with an average of 32 frames per second. Finally, with the Steam Deck hitting exactly 30 frames per second. And so really all of these at 15 watts are having a fun time with this game. Finally, for a brand new game that just dropped not too long ago, let's check out some Doom: The Dark Ages, which features a nice benchmarking suite, and for this one specifically we'll be using the Hebeth level, and this is going to be a good stress test, which can be seen with the average 34.19 frames per second for the Z2A, and the Z1 not too far behind with an average of 32.65, then the Z1 Extreme with an average of 38.44, and finally the Steam Deck OLED with an average of 36.1. I think it's safe to say across the various benchmarks that the Z2A is mostly in line with the Steam Deck's APU, which isn't surprising based on what we know, but it's pretty interesting to see that Z1 kinda hang on, and of course that Z1 Extreme doing very well at 15 watts with room to go up in power. The 20W preset is a nice addition for the Z2A, which does prove to be helpful in certain situations, giving the Xbox Ally much needed help to gain as many frames as possible. And it does appear that with the Xbox full screen experience and the combination of the 20W TDP preset, it does help the Xbox Ally close the gap and even push performance beyond, as we can see on screen here. It's also worth noting that the combination of the 60Wh battery and the 20W TDP kind of balances out, which we will examine in a little bit during the battery testing portion. Alright, enough of all these numbers, let's actually get into some gaming here. And we're going to first look at games that are on the demanding side to really see what we can do at that higher 20W preset. And then we will shift gears and check out lower TDP gaming, which is something that I like to do with x86 devices since battery life is always on everyone's mind. So let's just jump right into some Battlefield 6, which is about as new of a release as we can get here. And I will be honest, I wasn't expecting a whole lot here. And actually at first, not much happened because I had a DirectX error. That prevented me from playing the game, but I did manage to fix it and get it running, since you can clearly see on screen that I'm playing Battlefield 6 on the Xbox Ally. And I'll actually have a link to the Reddit post to help fix this issue in case you encounter it here or on another device. So for Battlefield 6, I am set to use that 20W turbo preset with a resolution of 1280 by 720, since again, if you look at the marketing for the Xbox Ally, this is a handheld targeting 720p handheld gaming. I do have the game set to low settings with both the screen space and SSAO turned off at a 100% resolution with a 30 frames per second target, and for the single player campaign, this seems to mostly be enough to give us a fairly stable and steady experience. Now for multiplayer, things obviously change a bit since it's far more demanding with even more things happening on screen and just the sheer amount of players at one time. And so for the multiplayer side, I do recommend adjusting some of the upscaling features, which then really starts to impact image quality. And I had a hard time really making out my enemies on screen, so it's kind of a mixed bag here unfortunately. The multiplayer side is clearly pushing the Xbox Ally very hard. Now, I always love checking out some of these Sony published games, and so naturally we've got both God of War Ragnarok and Spider-Man 2 here, and again for both of these games I am set to a 20W TDP with that target resolution of 1280 by 720. For Spider-Man 2, I am set to use AMD's FSR 3 with a dynamic resolution scaling of 30 and the very low preset, and this combination seems to be just the right balance between visual fidelity and frame rate stability. Now for God of War Ragnarok, we can make use of low settings with a 30 frames per second cap, and for this I am using AMD's FSR 3 again, but it's set to performance, and this is actually very nice and smooth, especially once you allow the game to do its initial shader compilation, which is definitely recommended. Now Stellar Blade was another game that was a PlayStation 5 exclusive for a bit, but now we can enjoy this fun action game on PC, and this is another Sony published game, possibly best known for its main character, but this is a game that is a lot of fun. Anyways, I've got Stellar Blade yet again using that 20W preset at a resolution of 1280 by 720 with AMD's FSR set to balanced, low settings, and a 30 frames per second target, and this is yet again another solid combination that allows us to enjoy the game here on the Xbox Ally. And another game that kind of surprised everyone was Clair Obscur Expedition 33, which is definitely well worth checking out, and another demanding game that is pushing the Xbox Ally even with the 20W preset at the 1280 by 720 resolution, using low settings, and we are hovering around 30 frames per second with this game. Finally, for our last demanding game, I wanted to check out some Sonic Racing Crossworlds, which is yet another fairly new release, and an awesome kart raider that I personally was very much looking forward to. For this game, we're using the 20W preset with a 30 frames per second cap, at 1280 by 720, low settings, a 100% resolution, but with the dynamic resolution set to a minimum of 75%, and we are getting very solid frame rate here despite the amount of action on screen or during track transitions, and so AMD's Van Gogh lives on to mostly survive another year of new releases. Now, it's pretty well known that the Steam Deck's APU performs quite well at those lower TDPs, and much of the same applies here with the Z2A in the Xbox Ally, and so let's now completely shift gears and check out the other side of the performance metric with gaming at that lower TDP, using the 6W silent mode preset, and it's impressive what can be achieved here with just the 6W preset in games like Megabonk, which is a new favorite of mine, and basically like Vampire Survivors but in 3D, is able to run at just 6W with that 1280 by 720 resolution, using the lowest settings possible, and despite the amount of action that can take place on screen at any given moment, we are still staying above 60 frames per second, and we might as well leave it uncapped since we do have a variable refresh rate display here. And if you follow along with me on the Retro Handhelds podcast every Monday, you know I've been working my way through Hades 2, which is no longer in early access, and I was very pleasantly surprised by its performance at 6 watts again, with that 1280 by 720 resolution, using low settings, and this game is staying close to or at 120 frames per second at just 6 watts, which is killer, and we will definitely look at what this all means for battery life in just a moment. Finally, I had to check out another solid test and game that comes to my mind as an option for lower power consumption, but still an amazing experience with Hollow Knight Silksong, which finally released after all these years. And again, with that 6 watt silent preset using a combination of low and normal settings, we are pretty close to or at 120 frames per second. Again, it's very solid and it's great to see for those that might just want these type of experiences on the go with exceptional battery life. So with PC gaming out of the way, it's time to dive into some high-end emulation, which is definitely something that I love to do here on the channel, and it's been a minute since I've specifically looked at emulation with x86 devices, and despite the Z2A being a budget chipset, I'd say that basically anything from the 6th generation and below will not be too much of an issue for this handheld, and so instead, we will use this time to focus on platforms that are high-end as well as better here with x86 or simply only possible on x86. Now let's start out with some PlayStation 3 emulation using RPCS3, and while we've seen some exciting advancements for those over on Android, RPCS3 is still far mature here with x86, and it's something that I really enjoy and have covered this topic quite in depth in the past using the ROG Ally X with its Z1 Extreme processor. So you've probably noticed on screen that I have one of my personal favorites for the PlayStation 3 with Resogun, and this is a gem that is developed by Housemarque, the same studio responsible for Returnal. It does look like things are going quite well for the Z2A since I've got Returnal running using just the 6 watt silent mode preset at the PlayStation 3's native resolution, and performance is just awesome and we can really sip on this battery. But unfortunately, this does start to change as we dive into more demanding games, and the Z2A's lack of the AVX512 instruction set as well as its age starts to become more apparent, since even a game like Skate 3, which is a game that typically does very well with something like the Z1 Extreme, is really struggling here and clearly pushing the Z2A very hard when looking at the numbers. I've got Skate 3 running here for this footage with the 20 watt turbo preset at a 75% res scale, and it's still not quite a smooth experience even with some tweaks. The situation does look a bit better when we move to one of my favorite racing games and franchises from the PlayStation 3 with MotorStorm Pacific Rift, and like Skate 3, I'm still using the 20 watt turbo preset with a 75% resolution scale, and using some of the built-in game patches, this game is running pretty well and definitely much smoother than what we were seeing for Skate 3. Finally, since it's always an important title for RPCS3 emulation, and definitely one of those benchmark games, I did make an attempt to run God of War 3 here with the Xbox Ally and its Z2A. And unsurprisingly, based on what we've seen, even with that 20 watt turbo preset and a 50% resolution scale, with some game patches to help with performance, we can sort of get close to what I'd consider playable performance, but really this isn't ideal, and it's more to show what the highest possible performance that we can get with PS3. And so I'd say that if you're going to explore PlayStation 3, you're going to want to stick to lighter experiences, and realistically, if you're wanting to dive into the PlayStation 3 emulation with much better success, something like a handheld with the Z1 Extreme will be what I'd suggest to look at as a minimum, and you can get a sense of that performance again with some videos I've done in the past, and I'll feature it on screen as well as in the description area. So let's move on to Xbox 360 emulation using Xenia Canary, and I tested some of my usual favorites for the Xbox 360, starting out with an overlooked and honestly forgotten gem at this point. Elo Milo is a charming platformer puzzler that was released way back as an Xbox Live arcade game. It's one that I like to use as a way to get a feel for Xbox 360 emulation with the device, since it's typically a solid performer across various devices. And here with the Xbox Ally, I am set to use the 15 watt performance preset, and the game is running very well here, and honestly we could probably get away with a slightly lower TDP using the manual adjustment. Let's check out something a bit more demanding, and easily one of my favorite racing game franchises, especially when you're thinking about Xbox, is Forza Horizon. And the Xbox 360 is where Horizon got its start, and this first entry in the series remains exclusive to the Xbox 360. And so it's one well worth checking out here, and I am making use of the 20 watt turbo preset to get that extra little juice, which gives us pretty solid performance with some dips here and there, but it definitely smooths out with more playtime. I think this game is a great example of where that extra slight power at 20 watts comes in handy for the Z2A. Finally, let's close out the Xbox 360 portion with another exclusive and a launch title for the Xbox 360 with Rare's Perfect Dark Zero, which is sadly the last time we've seen Joanna Dark in a new game, and so this is another one of those titles that is worth checking out here with emulation, since outside of cloud gaming, there's really no other way to enjoy this game on PC, and thankfully it does emulate pretty well, and much like what we saw with Forza Horizon, I am using the 20W turbo preset for that extra oomph, and performance is similar with some dips here and there, and clearly we are right at that limit for Xbox 360 emulation. And again, I think if you're wanting a bit better performance, having a little more power with something like the Z1 Extreme is definitely going to be welcome for Xbox 360 emulation. Finally, let's switch on over to the Nintendo side and check out some Switch emulation with the Eden emulator. And what I always like to do outside of the usual Nintendo experience is to check out some games that surprisingly don't have native PC versions. And one of those games happens to be Crash Team Racing Nitro Refueled, which is just an awesome remaster of Crash Team Racing from back on the PlayStation. This is a game that is running incredibly well, and I am using an 8W manual TDP in the docked mode at the Switch's native resolution, and it stays at its target frame rate without much trouble, and it's nice to have this ability with a lower power draw. Surprisingly, the same can be said for a personal favorite game of mine on the Switch, which is Kirby and the Forgotten Land, and likewise I have this game set to use the same 8W manual TDP, but I did have to use handheld mode for this one at the native Switch resolution, and overall it's a pretty solid experience, and the colors just look fantastic on this display. Finally, yes, I did have to test one of the most demanding games to emulate for Switch with Tears of the Kingdom, and I did make use of the NX optimizer with it set to the Steam Deck Legion Go settings, and as I expected, this experience is a bit of a mixed bag given how demanding this game can be even with that 20W TDP preset. The thing with Tears is that you really need to give it a good amount of playtime to really help smooth it out, and while we are above 20 frames per second outdoors and 30 frames per second indoors at times, there are still plenty of times that we are not. And I unfortunately just didn't have enough time to really let things smooth out, but I still wanted to show everyone the upper limit of what we should expect with Switch emulation, and overall I'd say Switch emulation will be pretty solid outside of those heavier outliers like Tears. And of course, after all this gaming, how does the Xbox Ally fare when it comes to battery life with its 60Wh battery? And so let's start out with the lightest test here using God of War 2 for the PlayStation 2 being emulated with PCSX2, and for this I am set to the Ally's 6W silent mode preset, running God of War 2 at native resolution with 50% brightness and volume, Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, the RGB off, and the display set to 60Hz, and it did pretty well, coming in at under 7 hours of on-screen time. And so this is generally where we will land when using that 6W setting. It kind of gives us an idea of what to expect, especially if you're targeting lighter games and indie style games for PC gaming. Now let's turn the power up to the next preset, and let's get a PC game going here with Returnal, making a return here. And no, I'm not going to make that old joke again, but we do have Returnal running here at the 15W performance preset, and we're still using 50% brightness and volume, with the Wi-Fi on, Bluetooth off, and those pretty RGB lights turned on, and Returnal is running at a resolution of 1280 by 720, using AMD's FSR set to balanced with no frame rate cap, and the low preset, and we came in just shy of 2.5 hours of on-screen time, and that's about where I expected us to land here with this setting. Now let's check out the 20W turbo preset with the same settings as before, and this time around we came in just shy of 2 hours of on-screen time at 1 hour and 51 minutes. And now this is pretty interesting because with that 60Wh battery, we can make use of that extra power here and still stay around 2 hours of on-screen time when you really need to push the hardware. And it does balance out any performance differences between the Steam Deck at 15W and the Ally at 20W. And again, you can see the benchmarks to get an idea of what that actually means. Finally, I did check the charge time, which took about 1 hour and 35 minutes from 0% to 100% with the included 65W power adapter. And in terms of standby time, it does seemingly work better than expected given we still have Windows there in the background somewhere, and I observed this over a few nights to kind of get a good sense of what we're looking at, and it does seem we're about 5% or so for 12 hours, and if we were to extrapolate that, it means we're at about a 10% loss per day, so there's a good chance your handheld will still turn back on after a week in standby. I also say good chance because, as I said, Windows is still there and some of the weirdness with Windows still happens, like your device taking itself out of standby for no apparent reason. Now, something that was clearly designed with reason was the excellent thermals here with the Ally, and I have to say that you're just not going to really notice that being much of an issue, even when you're pushing the Xbox Ally at that 20 watt setting long term, since this device seems to manage its thermals quite well, and moves heat away from the handheld as you would expect. The grips also really keep you away from that top center, which is where the Z2A processor lives, and so the unit overall just stays nice and cool and comfortable. And while the device is actively cooled with 2 fans as we saw on the Teardown, they're really not that audible, and again at that 20 watt TDP, with the fans running, it's not loud at all. So this was definitely a doozy of a video, and there's a lot to cover here, and honestly, there's more I could cover, and this base Xbox Ally is an interesting proposition, and almost, and I do say almost, in a similar situation as the 2023 Z1 Ally, which when first sold was $599, but it was up against the more powerful Z1 Extreme model that was only $100 more at $699, and so it made the original Z1 model a pretty poor value. But like with so many things in the tech world, the eventual sales, open box deals, and whatnot suddenly made it a decent value. In many ways, the Xbox Ally shares with that original Z1 model in that it's not the greatest value out there, but this time around, the more expensive Xbox Ally X comes in at $400 more than this Z2A model, but with more power, a larger battery, and additional little details. Xbox wants this to be the device that offers handheld freedom to all. And I do like that this is an option, since with realistic expectations, it will handle quite a bit, but it's also hard to ignore the outdated Van Gogh tech, the not quite fully baked Xbox experience, and I do worry that will lead to some confusion and disappointment among the public. This is an exciting and important step for a better and streamlined handheld experience with Windows, and I do hope we continue to see more effort made here. At the end of the day, I'm just here to show you what can be done, and if you are looking for something new at around $599, your best bet might be to wait on some sales for the Z1 Extreme. But if you're just looking for a companion to a more powerful desktop computer, or perhaps you are a console gamer that wants a bit more openness over something like the Steam Deck, this Xbox Ally can truly be an ally and let you clear out that enormous backlog of older games you might have. And with that, it's time to say goodbye, and I have a feeling I'll be back soon enough with another friend, or ally as you will. As always, I am the Retro Tech Dad, and thank you so much for watching.